Hello, everyone. Welcome to this out to lunch event in these very strange and new times. I'm speaking to you from Belfast, and usually out to lunch events feature a hearty bowl of stew and either a dash back to work or a long afternoon of drinking. But now you join us across the wireless waves, and we're delighted that you can do. I'm also delighted to welcome from London, I presume, Will Self. Hello, Will.
Hi, Hugh. Hello, Belfast.
A cheery hello from out there, from muted land. Well, thanks very much for joining us tonight. You're no stranger to Belfast and Belfast audiences, I suppose.
No. I mean, I think the most beautiful of the North British cities, far lovelier than Edinburgh. And I wish I was standing in central Belfast now and looking up at Divis Mountain, and I'm feeling very shut in here in London.
Well, I was going to ask you about the walking. I mean, obviously you're well known for your long walking and walking out of London once a year. Are you managing that this year?
No, I mean, the furthest I managed out of town was on a bicycle, and I managed about 2 days over the North Downs and down into the Surrey Weald. But such has been my rootedness in place that it felt like I'd crossed, the Himalaya by the Hindu Kush. As we were sort of freewheeling down towards Crawley, I was thinking, what marvels, what civilizations will we find here?
Beautiful Crawley.
Now, I think like a lot of people, and I'm sure maybe people over there in Belfast or elsewhere in the world who may get in on this live stream or this virtual encounter, the condition of lockdown seems to have both affected temporal duration and spatial consistency. It's felt harder to go. Inertia has been greater. It's been harder. The inertia in contacting people emotionally has been much harder, and almost the physical inertia. So I have exhaustively walked the quarter of London I live in. Exhaustively. I thought I knew the city before. I didn't know jack. Really. And now I even knew, and it's sort of like some kind of Socrates, I do know enough to know that I know nothing. Before, I didn't even know that much.
A learning curve.
It's ludicrous. I mean, how it exposed to me, even somebody like me who thought of myself as a little bit of a flaneur, still had a view of the city that was conditioned by media, conditioned by transport systems, etc. But I found it harder and harder to go further afield. I mean, I am technically in the shield category. I have a serious underlying health condition, and I have reasons for not being careful anyway. But over and above that, I felt an overplus, definitely.
It's been very interesting for everyone, but those kind of I was reading some of your articles about walking today, about striking out of London and sort of those really long walks, and you got out and up into Leighton Forest and Epping Forest and up further up there, and it would seem that there is a sense that you just naturally close in, you naturally kind of create boundaries for yourself, maybe. Beyond there is not safe, so here is my safety.
Well, if we wanted to be a little, you might say, having capitulated to pandemic disease, we're returned to the early modern or even medieval period.
Beyond the parish, I do not go.
Well, I mean, even in 1900, 90% of journeys under 6 miles in London were undertaken on foot.
Right. Yeah.
Public transport was expensive for working people. I live in a sort of little mansion block of flats by the Oval, the Surrey Oval in South London. These apartments were built for what would have been called clerks and computers, people who did figures in the late 19th century, early 1900s, and they would have walked into the city down Kennington Road every day. And I think that the pandemic is fascinating in the way that it's returned us to a habitus, to a way of immediate living, a kind of it is is contemporaneous with an era of pandemic disease, when when these diseases were endemic, almost as if we've automatically returned to the stage of technology prior to the effective eradication of infectious disease.
We do well, don't we, as a human race? We always sort of return to things very easily, like, mass war and pandemics and things like that. It's almost as if we don't want to let it go.
Well, I think Susan Sontag makes a brilliant point in her essay, which I think is salutary reading for the time of COVID, called "On Regarding the Pain of Others." Yeah. And she says very early in this essay, Sontag says, again, it's only in the post-Enlightenment period that anybody has thought that peace was natural. Yeah. That the irenic was in some way meant to prevail. But prior to that, everybody understood that war and strife were more or less the constant, and you were lucky to get periods of peace. Yeah. So I think we're reaping our own delusional state in a big time, but we know that, don't we? You don't need a horrible old Jeremiah like me to rub anybody's noses in it.
Well, we are here to talk about your new book, which I'm going to hold up. You can see it there, everyone, which is Will. And how has it been launching a book in a pandemic? Not easy, I would imagine.
Well, this is a paperback edition, and the hardback came out a year ago in November. But I think, almost as if there was some sort of pre kind of pandemic happenings going on. I don't think, I wasn't expecting the book to get a great deal of traction. It was reasonably well received. I think, like a lot of my work, a friend of mine said, you've managed to divide the critics as usual, Will. And I think it was an alumnus of Portora School in Enniskillen who said, when the critics are divided, the artist is in accord with himself. And actually, I passed by his house in Tite Street, Chelsea, just an hour or two ago on my afternoon walk. So, perhaps knowing I'd want to quote a Wildian pursuit at this point, but I think that's all. I've always cherished that line and never been too disquieted by nasty or bad reviews. I think it was a novel experience receiving ad hominem reviews, sort of that were targeted at me personally.
Because it's about you, because you're
when the book is obviously a memoir, but in which the ad hominem criticisms are of me when I was 17 to 25, not when I'm 59. I mean, it's sort of, and I think in a way, what was fascinating about that experience of people kind of slagging the book off and saying, just what we expect from that wanker Will Self and blah, 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 in whatever way they did it. I mean, let me say, Hugh, they go across the board. So the right-wing press here in England says I'm a class traitor. Right. And the left-wing press says I'm a disgusting, dead white man, a middle-class man. You can't win, either I lose, my identity is contested in any which way. But I think the interesting thing about that was that the ad hominem criticism of the memoir called out my very technique on why I'd written it the way I had. I mean, which in a sense was not to evade that critique, but to evade what I see as the perennial problem of memoir, which is, you place a narrative construction on events that you poorly remember, even if you have a good paper trail. Yeah. And you read memoir and you read autobiography and you think, really? When you say I fell over in the playground and a boy who was to go on to be so and so kicked me in the face, that wasn't you. What construction are you placing on that character? So, I tried to write this book in the third person and the continuous present in order to evade that problem, in order essentially to make it more truthful in a way.
Well, would you do us the honor of reading a little bit?
I will. This kind of sets the scene, and it already relates to some of what we've been discussing, because it's set very near where I'm now sitting. So the novel begins in Stockwell in South London in early 1986, when my young self is rather ruefully contemplating his up until then 7 years as a heroin addict. Will. How long has he been scoring through John? Jeannie made the introduction early last summer. It was a hot day, and they'd been skint apart from their score money, so trudged all the way up the Kennington Road, then the Clapham one, until they reached the Squats, a long, low block of flats, vestigially mock Tudor, with pitched roofs and bits of decorative half timbering. Up on the central gable, there was a plaque with 1916 inscribed on it. A bad omen, Will thought at the time. In front, there was a strip of bare earth, a row of sooty trunked trees, some fucked up old caravans up on bricks, broken down trucks and cars the same. When winter came and rain fell, this area became a soggy morass, churned up by the feet of the traveller kids who lived and played there. Some hope. That first time, they'd scored off Rosie, a plump for a junkie, light-skinned black woman Jeannie knew. Will remembers shooting up in Rosie's kid's bedroom while sitting awkwardly on the lower bunk, and then shifting to a leaking sag bag, from the hollow of which he'd first retrieved a dog-eared copy of Aleister Crowley's Diary of a Drug Fiend. He remembers flipping through its pages while Jeannie and Rosie talked animatedly in the adjoining kitchen, recalls marveling at the immemorial quality of the drug culture he was swagged into, its ossified, moth-eaten moors and tatty mythology. Will knew perfectly well that until very recently there'd been scarcely any junkies in London, yet now here they all were, thousands of the wheedling, whining fuckers, and all claiming direct descent from the likes of Crowley and Brother Bill, as if they'd been some sort of smackhead pilgrim fathers set sail on a golden brown sea. But the beast had slouched away, most probably to Bedlam, leaving behind only its molted fur, caught by the hem of a velveteen drape, then draggled back and forth by some warm and oniony draught. Later on, Jeannie and Will had visited other portions of the labyrinthine squat, and in one of them they'd met John, who had a pencil moustache and said he'd served with the Paras in Ulster. But then you hear a lot of that sort of martial bullshit from junkies. Still standing, yeah, in the Clapham Road, with the sky's chilly blue weight bearing down on him, and the glazed buns in the bakery window evilly gleaming, Will thinks of churned up dairy mud, sucking at teenagers' platform souls, getting their kicks, chucking bottles and bricks. Opposite them, grimly determined to do their duty, is a squad of Johns twitching in their khaki battle dress while they hold their rifles out to one side, so simultaneously aiming and making the characteristic soliciting gesture of junkies the world over. Yes, John had served the Queen in Ulster, and now he's serving up smack in Stockwell.
Rest assured, if we were in a room, Will, I think you'd be getting a hearty round of applause now from out in Zoom land there. That's just at the start of the book, isn't it?
Yes, that's the kind of opening scene which sees our very definitely anti-hero trying to persuade himself that he's going to be able to persuade his dealer to give him some smack, even though all he's got to offer him is a Danish pastry and a sachet of Capri Sun orange juice mixed from concentrate.
Yeah, it is. It is one of the more pathetic representations of drug use that I've ever read. And I mean, I think the obvious question for anyone in my position is, why write a memoir now after 11 novels and so many nonfiction and so much short story?
I think it was a cash consideration, frankly, Hugh.
Good.
I started writing my Umbrella trilogy in the late noughties, I guess around 2010. I knew I was taking a significant departure as a writer. I think you could say the career fits into probably 3 sections rather than 2. But even in the middle section, I was still writing recognizably satirical novels, often, based on an outrageous premise, quite hooked into the zeitgeist. Things like the Book of Dave that went on into the noughties, that it was probably my highest selling book. And then I took this radically different turn with Umbrella. It certainly was critically successful, and by reason of missing out on the Booker by a short nose to Hilary Mantel, was commercially quite successful for me as well. But of course, in terms of style and approach, it was a very different book. I went on and I wrote 2 further volumes of that trilogy. And I was very aware, I was surprised that I'd obviously gone as far as I had with the Booker for Umbrella. I was delighted, but I'd known it was a very risky departure for a writer, particularly in his middle years, to undertake a radical change in direction like that. And, I basically offered my publishers a memoir because I thought they'd be more likely to contract the books I wanted to write if they had something that looked relatively commercial to them. And certainly at the time that they bought the book, they must have believed that that was the case.
Yeah.
So, let's be honest at this end of history.
There was no, that's true, after the year we've had it move me as well. So there was no burning moment. There was no, like Kenneth Branagh.
No, and in a sense, sorry to talk over you, but it's a negative thing to do. For the reasons I've outlined, it's tendentious. Doesn't matter what you say in memoir. How do you avoid trying to big yourself up? Even if you bemerge yourself, as I think I've done in this memoir, you'll still be counter-accused of some kind of, delighting in kind of abasing yourself out of some kind of perverted desire. So you're on a hiding to nothing in that way. And artistically, I think it's a real problem as a genre. What are you doing here, in essence? Much as I love French culture and French literature, I think that, contemporary French writing has backed itself into a cul-de-sac with its obsession with autofiction and with, and in a way, this book could easily be a work of autofiction in that sense. And I could have quite reasonably packaged it as a novel. Simply the shift to the continuous present marks it out as clearly not factual in that sense. So I think there are all of those problems. But, inevitably, I'm going to stand by the book. I like the book more than most of the books I've written, and I've written quite a lot of them.
I think from someone reading it from who would know some of your novels, I haven't, now to my shame, I haven't read the more recent trilogy, but I would suggest that it is a memoir that actually analyzes things a little bit and creates there's a format and a style that you use that isn't one that I've read in memoir before. And I was going to ask, one of the structure is around 5 episodes, so 5 periods, some in London, some in Australia and India, and then finally in an awful, terrible sounding rehab clinic, which engendered, even though you are, as you say, a bit, debasing your own character in the memoir. I felt very sorry for you in the final chapter.
Oh, that's sweet of you to feel sorry for him. I agree. I feel sorry for him too.
Yeah,
And people are very mean about him. But he's a child.
yeah,
Well, I think, I mean, to preempt the obvious question,
mm,
people were very mean about poor young Will.
yeah,
No, they didn't think he was like young Winston. They were very, they were very mean about him, and particularly said that there was a lot of talk about, well, he gives no reason for how he ended up a heroin addict, and therefore we'll blame him. It's empathetic psychiatry. As if I'd had to supply a conventional view of an abusive childhood. But it's actually perfectly obvious from the book that this is a very neglected childhood, that his parents really don't have a clue what he's up to or what his life is like. And I'm sorry, as I may not have done that well, but as the father of 4 adult children, if one of my kids had been sitting up in their bedroom shooting up at 17, I would have known.
yeah,
Actually, I'm sorry, I'm not blaming my folks that much. They're long dead. It's not actually an exercise in shitbagging them.
no,
I didn't set out to do that. What I wanted to write about was what it was like being an addict in the late 70s and early 80s in London, which was a particular historical moment. I
yeah,
was fascinated by capturing zeitgeist and the structure, which is temporally recursive. You start at the end and then move forward to that end and leapfrog over it. It's a sort of boom, boom, tsh kind of structure, all in the continuous present. Like any literary structure, is everything is directed at bringing the reader into the experience. What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to make you understand what it was like being a heroin addict in London between 1979 and 1985.
yeah.
That's it.
Because one of the chapters is set the night that Thatcher becomes prime minister as well, which sort of stamps it with a particular time and a particular atmosphere, I suppose, as well. I mean, what comes across to me is being a little out of that time, the 90s, and in the 90s, obviously, it was great to take drugs, and everyone did it. It was fantastic. In the 80s, it was still, a niche pursuit, should we say?
Well, it wasn't a niche pursuit in the sense, and it certainly affected Northern Ireland as well.
Mm.
This great tsunami of heroin
Yeah,
entered the country, initially because of the fall of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran and the Iranian Revolution. And that's what opened up the routes. Some cynics would say a lot of wealthy Iranian families who fled converted their wealth into heroin in order to move it. And I'd be among those cynics. That did happen. But more generally, it opened up supply lines from the Golden Crescent. Before 1978, heroin in Britain had been from the Golden Triangle further east.
Yeah.
It had been rarer, and the writ of the Rolleston Committee of the 1920s had still held in British medical policy in relation to addiction, which was it was viewed as a disease. There was a network of drug dependency units that were allowed to diagnose opiates right up until the 70s, and there were very few registered heroin addicts. As I said, as the Will character knows himself in that expert set in 1986, before the mid 70s, there were hardly any junkies in Britain at all. There were about 500 registered addicts. Combination of factors. It wasn't just the fall of the Shah. It was the opening up of transatlantic plane routes. It was the GIs, deserting GIs and people on the Underground Railway fleeing the draft from America, blah, blah, blah. There were a lot of factors. But the heroin surge in the early 80s was absolutely unprecedented. It went from being absolutely niche to being a significant problem in every working class and a lot of middle class communities throughout Britain and markedly in North Britain as well, as we know, because it coincided with Thatcher. So the emblematic quality of having this, middle class kid, son of an academic in North London, whose Thatcher was our MP, so I knew the woman.
Yeah, you were in Finchley.
Yeah. Starting to take smack. That's the first time I take it, is the morning that she, and that's unfortunately is true. That is not an invention. I mean, you might argue it was serendipity to celebrate the beginning of 11 years of right-wing Tory government with the hit of drugs. But frankly,
I think I don't think you were the only person who had that reaction either.
no, no.
Go on.
No, I mean, not a lot more to say about that, but I think, you were interested in attitudes towards drugs and the hypocrisy that sounds drugs, and I haven't used heroin for many, many years now. Unfortunately, the period in rehab that I describe in the book was not the end of it for me.
Yeah.
I had another decade of serious drug abuse until I managed to get clean in my 40s, which is not a good look. I cannot advise it to anybody.
I think it's 20 years then.
I really cannot recommend that. It's not a good look. But what I will say is that the hypocrisy surrounding drugs endures to this day. And the primary hypocrisy is not, oh, well, alcohol's legal or tobacco's legal, they're increasingly unpopular. The hypocrisy is the extent to which I think I mentioned to you before that somebody close to me is terminally ill at the moment. In a conversation with his general practitioner, the GP let drop this little observation: opiate drugs are the only drug there is no limit on prescription for doctors in Britain. In other words, you can prescribe any dose. Okay.
Right.
Anybody who's watching this who has had a terminal, being close to somebody who's terminally ill and it's been drawn out at all, will have seen the amount of opiate-based analgesia that's brought to bear rapidly. Okay. We are a junkie culture. Most of us die as heroin addicts, and what does that say about our culture, really? Because the people who we damn for being heroin addicts earlier in life are engaged in a form of suicide anyway. It is suicidal to want to live as a heroin addict. It's a shitty drug. It blunts and deforms your experience of life. As William Burroughs, one of the great kind of ideologues of heroin, said, junk is not a kick, it's a way of life. And it's a bad way of life. It's a way of death. Let me be unequivocal about that. I hold no brief for it. But what are those addicts doing? Most of whom are mentally ill people, deeply unhappy, and I would argue engaged in a slow suicide. They're only the forerunners of our own terminally indulgent culture.
I mean, when I read about Will, and when I read of his sort of adventures, misadventures, if you like, I felt that it was somebody who was obviously very damaged, who was using drugs to not mask or fill, but as almost as a distraction, I suppose, or something like that. I felt that there was mental illness there.
Well, I mean, I certainly had the gamut of psy professionals in late adolescence and my early 20s, and that formed a lot of the subject matter of the first phase of my fiction, and I've returned to it again and again. I've always been preoccupied. I mean, I was never an inpatient. I've always managed as a writer to make a great deal out of very little in some senses, and also to, maybe it's an addict tendency. They say in recovery circles, you maximize and you minimize. Some things I've minimized, sometimes I've maximized. The mental health stuff, though, particularly again with a lot of us, you're perhaps a bit younger, but some of the people who may be watching this will have children, as I do, in young adulthood, and will be very concerned. I mean, I don't think it's any easier, don't get me wrong, for people with younger children. That's a whole set of different problems. But I think particularly with older children and young adults during the pandemic, the removal of any sense of continuity, it's like, I would say that Brexit was the moment that the generality of adults in this country really woke up and realized that the political class didn't know what they were doing any better than ordinary people in the street. That was a really important psychological climacteric that we passed through.
Yeah.
I think quite quickly into the pandemic, the bulk of young adults and older children realized that as well.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a difficult moment for a society, because and a difficult moment, and we tend to talk in terms of mental health because of the what's called the psychosocial-bio model of mental illness, as if we're then going to look it up in the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental illnesses, find the right pill, and solve it. But what we're really talking about is a far more profound problem that we as a culture are kind of facing. So, I mean, you say, well, that young man you see in the book had mental health problems. Yeah, he did, no question about it. But I think he was just at an extreme form of what all young people go through in our societies nowadays. And it's a question of how well they're able to repress or cope with it in some other way. Unfortunately, he found drugs, and more importantly, liked them, which I think.
Yeah, there is a sense, there's a glee and a bloody mindedness about his pursuit of drugs. I mean, as I mentioned, I grew up in the 90s, or sort of, it was 16 in 1990. So it was a very different attitude. Ecstasy sort of changed attitudes towards drugs in terms of its impact on culture. I mean, you talked about the impact of heroin on societies and things like that. The impact of ecstasy in somewhere like Northern Ireland. Still a story that needs to be written. It's been edged around the sides, but was dramatic. Sort of the idea of people coming together, taking drugs, euphoric drugs, and dancing together in a field was an enormously kind of what's the word? A breakthrough moment for Northern Ireland.
But it's cuddling, really, isn't it? Ecstasy. Everybody cuddles each other, which obviously, in a sectarian culture, is.
We need more cuddling. Maybe that's.
Well, yes, you might argue. I remember, to some extent, covering the Troubles in the early '90s, and you didn't see a lot of cuddling on the Falls Road at that time.
Yeah, it was all fields in Bangor.
But do you not feel that one of the problems for ecstasy was, it did have a lot of casualties. You can't get that high and cuddly without getting really down and depressed,
But there was a sense that it was a good, like a positive thing, and its story is told, even though, the people who tell that story hedge around it and say, well, there were some downsides and there were some difficulties there, but it's still told now. I mean, at the time there was the whole panic about it, and drink lots of water, don't drink too much water, all that sort of stuff. But actually, it's seen as a kind of positive thing, whereas the heroin story of the 1980s is a very, very different thing.
I think heroin's a profane drug. I mean, I think it's not a spiritual drug. It has nothing to offer. It impoverishes the connection between people. I mean, I think MDMA has its sharp corners, and I'm not a huge fan, but it's better than smack, to be blunt.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's always known that opiates are profane drugs. I mean, I personally wouldn't ban opium, but I'd always be wary of injectable heroin. I think it's a dodgy thing. I think societies reach their accommodations with drugs, and patterns of drug use change. I mean, it's interesting, of course, seeing the experiment that's going on with marijuana in the States at the moment. But I don't think there's any ideal solution to problems with drugs. Humans are always going to want to be intoxicated for all sorts of reasons, even if it's just spinning round and round till you feel dizzy and falling over, which is normally the first one we all discover. Or shinning up poles in order to induce autoeroticism, which we do from infancy. It's always going to happen. The question is, I was very influenced in my thinking on the subject by the fantastic anthropologist Mary Douglas, who wrote Purity and Danger, and she edited a collection of essays back in the 80s called Constructive Drinking, which was a collection of essays about how societies accommodate to drugs not how they fail to cope with them. So I always think we look at these things the wrong way around. I mean, it's a tender subject in Northern Ireland. It's a tender subject in central London. Alcohol. Alcohol is a really tricky drug and lethal. It's a lethal toxic drug. And yet we've managed to accommodate to it to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are ways, and society often sort of develops and moves out. I wanted to ask about style and the way that you write. There's a lot heavy use of italics, and there's also the playing with cliche and the idea of you use a number of cliches like little and often and waste not, want not, and these recur all the way through. And there's a kind of playfulness. What was the reasoning? I mean, I kind of understood the atmosphere that was being created by it, but I didn't know exactly what the meaning of them was.
Well, I mean, not to event shame you, but the stylistic innovations come with the trilogy of novels you haven't read, and they're carried over from there. So
the next time.
Exactly. So the modernist move was into the continuous present. The whole trilogy is written in the continuous present. The other thing is, I think most literary fiction relies on metaphor, doesn't it? It's sort of, if you read a standard line of what's called literary fiction, it goes dumpty 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 dum metaphor, dumpty 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 dum simile, dumpty. I don't like that artificial language. I don't think it's true to my psychic experience. I don't think in metaphors. I never thought, you didn't come on this call and I looked at him and I thought, Hugh in his cable knit pullover looked like a blah, 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 blah. I didn't actually think that. I just thought he's wearing a grey cable. If I even registered it at all. So what really, I would argue, in our psychic life, once you try and go into consciousness and render it authentically, which is always impossible, but at any rate, make a stylization that equivocates more exactly, is, actually cliche, verbal tics, idiomatic expressions. That is the very grout of our thoughts. That's what's always running on. And of course, it comes out in our phatic speech, in our to be honest and likes and do you know what I means? That is the overflow of what's actually going on. So that's partly. So when the italics, and this is, I mean, obviously it hasn't perhaps worked that well because people don't necessarily get it intuitively, are actually the point at which thought becomes words.
Right. Okay.
Because you know that thing, you're kind of, where are my keys? Where are my keys? Oh, I've got to get ready to go out. Where are my keys? Yeah. And then it's actually in words. And that is a paradigm for lots of the relationship between, as it were, semi-consciousness and full reflective consciousness. And I wanted to express the difference between the two levels of awareness. So when you move into italics, it's a much more self-conscious form of thought in that way.
There's all sorts of stuff come out of it as well. There's song lyrics and there's snatches of things that other people said during the book that come back and things like that. I thought it was very interesting. And actually, I suppose if you were a junkie, there's this constant thought, this constant movement about.
Well, there's two overriding factors that the addict mind is plagued by. One is obsessional psychic content. It just comes round and round and round again. Hence the repetition, hence the obsession with again and again, because it is. And the other is magical thinking. Is as long as I think the deal's it's gonna be a lousy deal of smack, it'll be a great deal of smack. As long as I think, it's that mental inversion the whole time. And I've spoken to so many addicts over the years, and everybody has it. I think everybody has it anyway, but it rises to a crescendo in the addict mind because it synergizes with the obsessional phenomenon. So you're caught in it in that way. And I think that is true. Why magical thinking? Well, it's quite obvious once you analyze it. The addict is a kind of puppet. The addict really, addiction, I would argue, only makes manifest what is latent in the human condition anyway, which is we're pretty much determined in most of what we do. In the addict's case, though, the compass of that determination has become much tighter. It's all going around much, much faster. So, how does the addict seek to escape the fact that he or she cannot control their actions?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the answer is you try and escape it through magical thought.
Makes sense. I wanted to ask about the relationships, because obviously you're going back to relationships that you had and people that you had relationships with at the time. How did it feel writing about those people again, I suppose, if you...
Um, Obviously, I changed names and
Yeah,
appearances and everything to protect people. I have to say, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I haven't had anybody get in touch with me and say, "You bastard, how dare you traduce me," at all.
right,
That
right.
hasn't happened.
Yeah,
The woman I was with throughout this period, I couldn't be that cavalier with. I'm still friendly with her. I certainly had no desire to hurt her, and I showed her the manuscript first,
right. Okay.
and would have given her some control over copy. I'm not claiming that I would have completely altered things. As it was, she was completely happy with it and happy with how it was, and didn't, and importantly, because she didn't question any of the actuality at all. It was
Oh, really?
fine for any of the facts side of it at all.
Right, okay.
But I would agree, as a novelist, as the fact everybody's familiar with Philip Roth's line, when a writer's born into the family dies,
Yeah.
But my experience has been that you can write up a terribly embarrassing episode involving one of your closest friends in which they've utterly humiliated themselves, and you simply have to change their name from kind of Dave to Gary, and they never notice. They'll even read the book and go, "That what happened to that Gary guy was ridiculous," and you're sitting there thinking, "That happened to you, fool."
I was interviewing Patrick Frayne, who writes for the Irish Times, and he put out a memoir, essays memoir, and just brilliant stuff. But yeah, it was only when he told people that they were in it that they actually recognised themselves. So.
That's exactly right. But I would say with the memoir, I did feel I was trespassing much more, and I've seen the impact because people have written stuff about me over the
Yeah,
years, and you know what? I don't like it.
yeah,
So
of course.
I am sensitive to those issues. It's a problem.
Did you feel it limited you at all, or did you manage the
Well,
process?
it changed the focus.
Right.
What did I want to write about? I paradoxically ended up writing a book that was much more, a lot of the reviewers said, who were kind about the book, nonetheless said it has to deal with being in the genre
Yeah,
of the kind of drugalogue.
yeah.
And I think it pushed me much more towards focusing on the drugs, not
Mm,
wanting to trespass on the relationship. So, I'm writing a book. Of course, I had other relationships. I hint at my kind of intellectual and artistic development as a young man. It's a kind of Kunstler man as well at
mm,
the same time, but I don't over-egg that.
right.
I don't think anybody would read it and think, yes, of course, this young man's going to be a writer. What I
Mm,
was most interested in plot terms and what kind of fitted with the way I decided to structure the book was I really wanted the end of it to leave you in doubt of where you, despite knowing the reality of whether this guy was going to make it. Because when I look back on my young life and when I consider that, you know, after that spell in rehab, I was clean for a couple of years and then resumed using hard drugs.
yeah,
I'm surprised I did, frankly.
yeah.
It's a puzzle to me because it was a long, difficult period, as you rightly say, of mental illness.
And
But
was it?
yeah, I think that I centered much more on the relationship with drugs, probably to avoid transgressing on other people. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there are people in the book who don't make it out. Obviously, there was a friend at the time who didn't, who you very movingly write about as well. I mean, I think that it's always a question for people who haven't been in that situation. Why do some people make it out and some people don't?
Chance.
Just
Why are you sitting in Belfast and I am in London? You know, why are some people black and some people white and some people? I mean, the contingency. This, you know, Polish writer, science fiction writer Stanislav Lem,
Yeah,
once calculated that the odds against him being born were 8 billion to 1. You know, I mean, obviously it's an absurd and sort of future, but you know, the role of chance in people's lives and the I mean, the necessary understanding that that is a factor, and at the same time, the extreme appreciation that it was probably all doomed to happen anyway.
yeah, totally.
That's the tightrope we all walk, isn't it? But yeah, I've never ever doubted that the element of luck in surviving that must be huge. I mean,
Yeah.
particularly with injectable drug use. I mean, it's lethal. I mean, it's
Mhm.
you're sticking a syringe full of a liquid with impurities in you. You don't know the dosage. You might get. I mean, weirdly, the only time I ever did get septicemia was after I'd given up shooting up drugs. But you know, I've no doubt that I was weakened for those kinds of infections as well.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some scenes in it where you think, you know, the willful recklessness and the kind of there's a bit with a bent needle that, you know, I shivered a lot reading that, and you think, you know, how risky people's lives are, especially when it's engaged in something like heroin and
Yeah,
or
but I mean, lots of people's lives are risky, and
yeah,
it's a question of how we calibrate the risk, isn't it?
mm,
You know, I mean, it's Schopenhauer who said that insurance is a sacrifice upon the altar of public safety. You
mm,
know, it's sort of, um, you know, we all factor these things, and of course, it's another thing that the pandemic has exposed to us
mm,
is what we think are acceptable risks and what sort of risks we think are acceptable as well. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, that was particularly unacceptable levels of risk taking. There's no doubt about it. And you know, but you're not going to get me sitting here saying, well, you know, everybody should do national service or young men should do national service in order or play more rugby, you know,
yeah,
in order to kind of deal with their
yeah,
risky tendencies.
and their needs. Yeah, no, I mean, one of my favorite chapters is well, part of the chapter is when you're in Australia because you feel very free and you seem to write quite freely. Um,
I'm off drugs,
yeah,
mostly
yeah,
off it.
yeah.
I'm off heroin for a while.
Mm,
Australia made a huge impact on me. I mean, the book I'm working on at the moment is partly a response to, you know, my sense of
mm,
the singularity of Australian Aboriginal culture, which just made a huge impact on me.
yeah.
I went over on one of those working visas. I think you can still get, well, not right now if you're under 25. My father had emigrated when I was 19, so a few
Mm,
years before, and was teaching at the Australian National University in Canberra. And I stayed with him initially, and then he got me a job through friends working for the Northern Territory government in Darwin, which was a very remote place in the early 80s. There'd been the cyclone a few years before, and it
mm,
was a town of 40, 50,000 people. You know, and the nearest next town was 2,000 miles away. It was a very
yeah.
remote place. And of course, when I chipped up there, I found quite a few other junkies who were on the run.
Well, that was one of my favorite things is learning what Australian slang for smack is. Hammer.
Yeah,
I,
hammer and tack,
hammer.
smack. Yeah,
That's reading for you.
yeah, that's reading. It'll enrich your mind. But yeah, that sojourn in Australia was such a sort of curious segue between a kind of light William Boyd novel
Yeah,
about kind of late colonial life in Africa
yeah,
and a sort of junky sort of saga. So it was very odd. And you know, I made this quite good friend who was teaching Lindy Chamberlain, the dingo baby killer
oh,
at the
fun.
time. She
Yeah,
was in
fun.
Berrima Jail in Darwin,
Yeah.
and he'd already lived in remote communities and knew people in the Aboriginal communities. And I
Mhm.
met, and it was just so utterly different an experience.
Mhm.
And as I say, I've returned to it again and again.
Mm. No, it's fascinating. I mean, and for me, the one thing I would say is to everybody who hasn't read the book is it's bloody hilarious. I laughed and I laughed and I laughed inappropriately, and I laughed at times when I really probably, really shouldn't have done because of the subject matter. But it's really funny.
I have to say, to interrupt, I mean, thank you for that,
No.
and deliberately so, and deliberately so.
Yes,
I've
yeah,
never understood any book that doesn't have jokes in it,
no,
frankly.
no,
No,
it's a,
because, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you invert it through Freud and say there are no such things as jokes, then in which case, why aren't there any jokes in your book? I mean, it doesn't
yeah,
matter. Life is a chiaroscuro. We all know that. There's light and dark.
true enough. I have a couple of questions from the floor, as we might say. Nuala asks, what drug would you suggest might help us through today's situation?
Oh, well, I'm a big fan of marijuana. I think marijuana should be legalized. I have to say the legal marijuana culture in California, where I've spent time since it was legalized, is pretty annoying and makes it very childlike, like it's as load of sweeties. But maybe that's just California. Mind
Yeah,
you, it's like that in Holland as well. But we can do better
yeah,
here
we
in
could,
Britain.
a
I think,
stern British kind of
yeah,
marijuana.
I think marijuana, non-toxic,
Yeah,
non-carcinogenic, uh, a boon to people with muscular pain, all sorts of, virtually a Catholican when
yeah.
it comes to kind of low-level medical treatments, and no toxic overdose, etc., etc. There is no argument that it's better for us than alcohol.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So smoke them if you've got them, Nuala. And then John asks, do you envisage a second memoir at any point in the future?
I've got to confess, having done this one, I wouldn't mind doing
Yeah.
the bad 30s as well as the bad 20s. Just as a writer, not personally. Personally, I think I'd find it nauseating and upsetting. I mean, it's closer to now. There's
Mm,
more of the long tail of that damage is still around, and I would never minimize that.
yeah.
But in literary terms, it would be fun because the set pieces that, some of which you found funny,
Yeah.
are even more kind of funny in that ways.
And there are some legendary moments, obviously, in the 1990s as well.
Yes, there are some notorious moments. Yeah.
So there's one other question or a couple more questions. Ian asks, what is our relationship to our younger selves? So he's asking, is a continuous self an illusion created by memory? He intimates that you want to sort of slightly distance yourself from Will in the book.
Yeah, I was very influenced by. I was taught philosophy by a man called Galen Strawson, who's now professor of philosophy at Reading, and one of the preeminent British philosophers. I was extremely lucky, and he had a big influence on me. Taught me as an undergraduate, and he's always had a very skeptical view of, of the self.
Yeah,
Galen actually thinks we start anew every day with a new identity.
every morning, yeah.
And a paper of his that I read, which I would urge on you, is called Against Narrativity.
Yeah.
And it's an analysis of exactly that question. Is our view of ourselves, as it were, diachronic, or is it synchronic?
Mhm.
Are we just now, or are we the little boy or girl who scraped their knee in the playground aged 5 or 6? Is that us?
Yeah.
You might know a lot of our politics at the moment centers on that issue as well. It seems a crux for a lot of us.
Yeah.
My view is, of course, we're both. We are legion, in the words of the gospel according to St. Mark. And one of the confusing things about being legion is we flip between being synchronic and diachronic, and we also flip in between them. Our synchronic identity critiques our diachronic, and our diachronic identity critiques our synchronic. But what we're not is one or the other. There's no question of that. You are, in an important sense, related to your childhood self, but in an important sense, you're divorced.
Yeah, there's a part in the book where you talk to your dad about that.
Yeah.
About the world, and how what the doorknobs were like during World War II, and that sort of thing. And he doesn't engage with it. He just he lives
Yeah,
there.
but the great thing about it, and that's a verbatim conversation. I remember this so well, and it did take place in the Grand Atlantic Hotel in Weston-super-Mare. Is he was great, my dad. He was honest. He was just very honest. He just said, "I totally understand what you're saying, but I'm not that sort of person. I am." A synchronic person. It's always now for me. It's kind of now. And it's true. He didn't. I mean, he would recognize things, but unfortunately, the now for him was kind of 1932.
I hope that answers your question, Ian. So there's three more questions. I think we've got time for that. So Declan asks, if you've been living now, as a teenager and a young adult now, 2010s to 20s, as an addict, how do you think you would have fared?
Well, I mean, I've sort of lost touch with the addict community to some extent, and I'm glad that I have. The short answer is I really don't know. I'm out of touch with, I mean, what's interesting, and again, there was a brief moment of kind of, Kate Moss was meant to be modeling heroin chic, and, there were kind of, Catherine Hamnett did T-shirts that were sort of smacky, and there was often talk of kind of Sloane Rangers doing heroin at their parties, but it never made it into being a socially acceptable drug. When I do talk to young people who have addiction problems or of their milieu, they still say the kids that get into heroin disappear. They go off to one side. So the answer is, I should imagine it's just as shitty, horrible, and awful as it ever was. I mean, the harsh fact of the matter is you're not going to get the one thing that might stop you using street drugs that would likely kill you, which is a well-regulated and surveyed medical prescription for medical heroin. You're not going to get that. And in fact, I think it's even harder to get scripted for methadone than it probably was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think it might even be harder. And from what I know of the black market, it's just like the black market in drugs always is. It's nasty and brutish.
Finton, Chris asks, have you read a lot during lockdown? We always ask writers this because we presume you read 17 books a day. But
well, I had a good summer. I had a lot of stuff I wanted to read in the summer. I mean, quite technical stuff and stuff I was interested in. A lot of reading in philosophy I wanted to do, which I felt I'd been neglecting, and I went reasonably hard at some of that, but not really. No. I think, I'm not going to lie or try and make unlike you, Hugh, I'm not appearing with a display of good books behind me. I found it hard to concentrate. I think a lot of people have, and there's been personal things happening and stresses with the kids and this sort of thing. That this is the first year I haven't been writing a book since I was 28 or something like that, and I'm 59. So the first year in 31 years that I haven't been working on a book. So I think that gives you the ambit of it. I have done some reading. I've enjoyed some of the reading, but it's not been with the fixity. I kept thinking to myself, and I don't know if anybody else out there can identify, almost every day, particularly when lockdown has been severe, I've thought to myself, and let's face it, I mean, I've thought to myself, why can't I just relax and read a book a bit more? And I found it very hard.
Yeah, it's difficult to rest enough. One final question, and this comes from Finton, and you'll have to explain this well, because I presume you're going to get this. How are you enjoying being a peer of the realm of Sealand?
Yes, I am Lord Self now, that's true.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I wrote about it in my column for the New European last week, and thank you. Some people are saluting me out there. I say in the column, I'm quite equivocal. I'm not, by no means the Republican firebrand I once was.
Yeah.
In the sense that you know, I don't think that the Windsors are any great shakes or anything, or the institution of monarchy is any great shakes, but we're in such a worrying, fractious period that some institutions that have at least have a negative capability
Yeah.
may be keeping a lid on things. But on the other hand, I could never bend the knee to the daughter of a party planner or you know, I just couldn't do that. You know, it's just
Yeah.
not in my power. And if I couldn't do it, how could I ask it of anybody else? And I've never stood for the loyal toast or any of that
Yeah.
flummery or mummery. I just can't do it. Uh, and by the same token, I couldn't pay to have a peerage from the British state. They're expensive. You have to give most of the money to the Tory party, and maybe a bit to charity, and I wouldn't enjoy doing that. However, Sealand, which is an abandoned World War II gun platform,
Yeah.
6 miles off the coast of Essex and Suffolk, declared itself an independent nation over 40 years ago, and does a nice line in titles through its website. And one of my PhD students, very sweetly, bought me a lordship. Uh, you know, and I think, in a sense, just as Britain has left the European Union, thereby relegating itself to be an insignificant fly speck of a landmass off the northern coast of Europe, it behooved me to evacuate my claims to nobility to an even more insignificant fly speck of land off the coast of this one. Simple, really.
I mean, very often, if you get the freedom of a city, you can drive your sheep through Dublin, for example. You
Yes.
can do that. Do you have any rights? Are there any kind of seigneur sort of rights that come with this title?
No. Bluntly, no. There are no rights. There are no rights, and like most people who sit in the House of Lords here in London, no duties either.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. Well, yes, we have a couple of those ex MPs who landed up there.
Well, I'm slightly responding to the fact. I mean, it's a disgusting thing, but I am what I am. I'm of an age and of a background where I actually know people who are getting honours. And, you know, I just never say anything to them. I regard it as being like an attack of psoriasis. I mean, quite unsightly to look at and presumably really embarrassing.
Well, it has been lovely. This is the book, everyone. So you can buy it anywhere on the internet. But if you go to No Alibis, which is the finest bookstore in these islands, you will get 10% off. And you probably, I think the website is up and running at the moment, even though the bookshop is not open. And David and all the staff there will sort you out. Alan, thank you very much for producing this evening and making everything work, which I'm sure if Will and I had been left to our own devices, we might not have been able to pull it off. And thanks everyone out there for listening. Keep posted for Out to Lunch events running for the next 2 weeks. And Will, thank you very much for your time and good luck.
Thank you, Hugh. Take care now.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.